Leaders recently gathered for the 54th World Economic Forum in the Swiss ski resort of Davos. Leaders engaged in high-stakes meetings about key world issues and global economics. For more on this conversation, we're joined by Econometrix Chief Economist, Director Dr. Azar Jammine. Dr. Jammine, good to speak to you as always. Now, the recent discussions at Davos focus on the trustworthiness of economic models that are used across the globe. Now, in light of criticisms from figures like Christine Lagarde, how do you perceive the current state of trust in various economic models?
I think a lot of the dissatisfaction comes from the fact that there's a perception that the economic models did not forecast that inflation would rise quite as quickly as it did in the wake of the measures taken by various governments to combat the effects of COVID-19. And conversely now, there's a lot of pressure among some economists for governments and central banks to reduce interest rates rapidly. And the criticism of central banks for not doing so rapidly at the moment is that they were far too late in starting to raise interest rates in the first instance to combat inflationary pressures. So how can we believe you now that inflation is still going to stay high enough for you to have to keep interest rates high? The fact is that economics is not a science. It is a behavioral science. There are many, many factors that influence it. And even then, if you look at some of the sciences, take medicine, take engineering, there are fallacies in all of them. How many people will acknowledge that the medical treatment that they have had has proved to be incorrect? And the same thing with engineering. Engineering disasters are often attributed to the fact that the engineers didn't, there was something wrong with the kind of engineering design that was instituted. In that way, economics is not dissimilar from these others, but it has that one extra facet, and that is that psychology and social norms actually play an important role in economics. It is not a pure science.
Now, there are suggestions that these economists speak from one or two pages of the same book, if you will. In fact, Christine Lagarde criticized economists as a tribe of clique, and she suggested the need to bring in people outside this tribe for a more diverse perspective. Now, how can diversity of thought contribute to more accurate economic predictions and policy recommendations, do you think?
Very much so. I tend to agree with her. I often see that, economists who work for a particular institution tend to follow a particular line of thinking, and the institutions get together and kind of tend to agree on pursuing that line of thinking as well. And it doesn't open them up sufficiently to a much broader perspective. I think it depends very much on the economist that you're dealing with. There are economists who are independent, who actually do look into the situation from a far broader perspective, as opposed to the market economists who are there just to and are employed by the institutions that they work for to try and enable those institutions to make as much money as possible. And that does not necessarily lead to the correct type of economics thinking that is required.
Now, Dr. Jammine, don't know if it would be out of the question to look at organizations, some of the Breton Woods institutions, if you will, who make various recommendations to largely African countries or developing nations on various economic policies to implement. Is the same school of thought applicable to what Lagarde is talking about, that many of these recommendations that they've given to these developing countries may fall under the same potential problem?
There's no question that they have done in the past, but I have also identified certain aspects of these Breton Woods institutions of actually trying to be resilient enough to adapt to new ways of thinking and the new kind of influences that are very relevant for economic thinking, especially in recent years. But there are some basic principles that you cannot tamper with. When people borrow money, there is an interest rate payable on that, and they become liable to pay that interest. Where the Breton Woods institutions may have possibly be lacking has been to be so dogmatic in actually insisting on some of the African countries actually meeting their commitments when the environment is not necessarily conducive to that in terms of, in order to meet some of those commitments, it involves a tremendous amount of pain in certain areas of those African economies, and the Bretton Woods institutions may not have been fully accepting of the kind of pain that is actually called for. But they have actually been adapting and have changed their stance on a number of things over time. There's no question about that in recent times. So I wouldn't be too critical. The fact is that the African countries are still heavily dependent on those Bretton Woods institutions. And the question that needs to be asked is, why can the African countries themselves not develop a way of thinking about managing their economies that leads to less dependence on the Bretton Woods institution?
Great question there, Doctor. But the other question also speaks to just how much latitude these African countries have to adapt the various policies that they are asked to implement, but those that are their funding partners. And the question I want to ask is, do these Bretton Woods institutions go into these countries and study the economics of each particular country? You'll imagine that what's going on in Nigeria, Zimbabwe, or South Africa, for that matter, economically, is very, very different.
They certainly do. They've got huge teams of economists, admittedly, who are trained mainly in the West, who are seconded to going to study these African economies one by one. I know quite a few of them do. Admittedly, they may not be completely au fait with the spirit and the kind of psychology of the people of every economy, but they try their best within the parameters of what they know on how economies should work. And that brings me back once again to the question of, if there were a better solution, why have the African countries themselves not evolved those better solutions and gone out on a limb? Take the example of China. How come China was able to, or Singapore, have been able to develop themselves despite these Bretton Woods institutions with their own human capital and evolved economic systems that do not necessarily in any way subscribe to the kind of system envisaged by the Bretton Woods institutions, and they've been quite successful in developing their own models. But African countries have been singularly unsuccessful in doing so, and South Africa finds itself in a similar situation. We do find ourselves in a kind of a blockage between those who say, the market must do everything, the private sector must do everything, and on the other side, those who say, no, don't speak to me about the private sector, government must control everything, even though we see what a mess government is making of managing so many of these SOEs and service delivery more generally.
Now, South Africa recently experienced a controversy with the Davi Leoka, bringing attention to economists' influence. Now, to what extent do economists play a crucial role in advising governments and formulating policies, and what are the limits to their powers, if you will?
Well, if you ask me, I've been giving my views on what should be done in the economy for many, many years, but it's not necessarily adhered to by the powers that be. So, yes, we can give our suggestions, but there's a big gap between giving suggestions and the government acting on those suggestions. And if I might say, I suspect that some of the suggestions that Davi Leoka may have given government were not actually were not implemented. And many of us feel that if some of our suggestions were implemented, we wouldn't be sitting with an economic growth rate of 0 to 1% and an unemployment rate of 1.6%. We would be doing a lot better. A lot of it has to do with education as well, and education in economics and how the economy works. And unfortunately, the majority of people in this country are not able to comprehend that. And in part, that goes back to the fact that so few South African children ever get to do maths at a sufficient level to be able to have the cognitive insight into understanding how an economy works. So economists try their best, but if the education system doesn't develop the populace sufficiently to be able to, and especially the thinking amongst politicians of how best to enforce economics thinking, then you're on a path to failure.
Now, very quickly, Doctor, how much of this is attributed to a lack of willpower? Because you talk about countries like Singapore, you talk about China that were in similar problems, but have been able to dig themselves out of those problems. And one would imagine that all these countries have great minds. The potential difference might just be the willingness of the politics to take the hard measures.
It's more complex than that. Yes, there is an aspect of the willingness of the politicians, but another crucial aspect where South Africa has failed dismally and where countries like Singapore and China have made immense progress is developing their own human capital. In other words, they themselves have taken it upon themselves to educate their people as far as possible, and especially in areas that are associated with the direction in which economic activity and technology is going. And here in particular, one's thinking of maths and science. But of course, you need literacy in order to understand maths and science as well. So all three go into play. And even though we pride ourselves in having an 82.7% or 82.9% matric pass rate, the question to ask is how many of those children who passed matric did sufficient mathematics to understand what is going on in the world economy and to be able to adapt to the kind of technologies that are being developed left, right, and center and providing growth in other areas of the world.
Some important questions you raised there, Dr. Jammine. Appreciate your time. Econometrix Chief Economist and Director, Dr. Azar Jammine.